recent years, India has found itself surrounded by an increasingly unstable neighborhood. While South Asia has long been prone to turbulence, the last 5 years have witnessed India's bordering states descending into chaos of political and economic instability. Each crisis is driven by its own dynamics, but the common thread is the erosion of democratic institutions, deepening of economic distress, and the inability of ruling elites to navigate social discontent without resorting to repression or authoritarian tactics. Let's break all of this down in today's episode of TACXplained. Myanmar was the first to collapse into outright crisis when the military seized power in February 2021. That is when they detained Aung San Suu Kyi and President Win Myint. Just months after the National League of Democracy's sweeping electoral victory. Allegations of fraud rejected by observers gave the military a pretext to dismantle Myanmar's fragile democracy and tighten its grip on power. Since then, the country has plunged into crisis. Emergency rule has been repeatedly extended, peaceful protests have turned into armed resistance, and fighting with ethnic militias has led to the new People's Defense Forces, much of the country in near civil war, and millions have been displaced. The economy has collapsed with shrinking GDP, soaring inflation, broken trade routes, shortages of essentials, and rising food insecurity, while sanctions and capital flight have deepened isolation. Once seen as a promising frontier market, Myanmar is now sinking into poverty under the junta that rules through fear and repression, trapping the country in paralysis and its people between authoritarian force and desperate resistance. Coming to Afghanistan, Afghanistan's collapse came swiftly in August 2021 when the Taliban marched into Kabul, toppling the US-backed government with almost no resistance. Years of corruption, weak governance, and the Afghan leadership's dependence on external aid has left the state fragile. Meanwhile, the US-Taliban deal and the hurried withdrawal of America stripped the then Afghan government of any legitimacy and security guarantees. President Afghan Ghani fled. The Afghan forces melted away and the Taliban declared the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, installing an all-male leadership dominated by its old guard. Since then, the group has prioritized consolidating control and enforcing its strict interpretation of Sharia law over building inclusive governance or economic recovery. Women have been driven out of public life, freedoms curtailed, and institutions dismantled, leaving a population trapped between authoritarian rule and a humanitarian collapse. The economy has contracted sharply, aid flows have dried up, banking and trade remains restricted along with widespread hunger, pushing millions into dependence on humanitarian relief. Yet the Taliban remain uncontested, not because they have restored stability, but because no alternative power has emerged, making Afghanistan's current calm less of a peace than silence of a country without options. Coming to Pakistan, Pakistan's turbulence since Imran Khan's removal in April 2022 is not a sudden departure from democratic governance rather than a deepening of a chronic pattern that has defined its politics since its independence. The no-confidence motion that toppled Khan, aided by defections and his fallout with the military, triggered a spiral of protests and resignations of lawmakers from Khan's party, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf. It also led to violent clashes after Khan's arrest in May 2023. But it also exposed a familiar truth. In Pakistan, elected governments rise and fall at the army's discretion. The state responded with a heavy crackdown, mass arrests, censorship, and restrictions on political activity, while the military reasserted itself as an ultimate arbiter of politics. The 2024 elections, widely criticized as unfair, saw PTI candidates stripped of their party symbol and forced to contest as independents. Yet, they still managed surprising gains, underscoring Khan's enduring popularity among the youth and urban middle class. Despite this, Shehbaz Sharif retained power through a fragile coalition backed by the military, while Khan himself was jailed on corruption charges. His party hollowed out by state pressures. Economically, Pakistan still struggles with mounting debt, inflation and stalled reforms, leaving a society wary of crisis. What emerges is a picture of chronic instability, a political system where civilian governments are weak, opposition is repressed but resilient, and the military looms as the decisive force, ensuring that Pakistan remains locked in a cycle of uncertainty and confrontation. Coming to Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka's collapse in 2022 was one of the starkest reminders of how economic mismanagement can tip a state into political breakdown. Years of reckless borrowing, ill-judged tax cuts, and dependence on foreign debt compounded by Rajapaksa's family concentration of power pushed the country into bankruptcy. By mid-2022, fuel and food shortages, soaring inflation and power cuts triggered mass protests that culminated into the storming of the president's and the prime minister's residences, forcing Gotabaya Rajapaksa to flee and resign. This was a rare instance of popular mobilization toppling entrenched elites. Yet the transition quickly revealed its limits. Ranil Wickremesinghe, elected president by a parliament still dominated by Rajapaksa's allies, restored order but not legitimacy, relying on a repression to quiet dissent while negotiating an IMF bailout. The $2.9 billion package finalized in 2023 stabilized supplies of essentials but came with harsh conditions like tax hikes, subsidy cuts, and restructuring of state enterprises that kept ordinary citizens under severe strain. While inflation has eased since then and tourism has revived by 2025 this year, unemployment and poverty remain high and the political system continues to be shaped by Rajapaksa's residual influence. Wickremesinghe governs in partnership with creditors and the military more than with the public, leaving many Sri Lankans under delusion. The state has survived bankruptcy, but popular faith in governance remains hollow, making recovery more fragile than it appears. Bangladesh's political order fell like a house of cards in August 2024, ended more than a decade of authoritarian governance under Sheikh Hasina, whose rule combined impressive economic growth but with growing repression of dissent. The spark was the reinstatement of a controversial quota system for government jobs favoring the descendants of the 1971 war heroes, which ignited massive student-led protests. The government's heavy-handed response, curfews, mass arrests, and orders to shoot on sight only deepened outrage, transforming a single-issue movement into a broader revolt against years of shrinking democratic space, politicized institutions, and the dominance of the Awami League. Eventually, an interim government was appointed under the leadership of Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus that drew support from the students and promised reforms before elections. However, the reality on the ground remains fraught, with tensions ranging from a dissolved parliament to extensive pressure on the interim government to restore political order. Once seen as a South Asian success story, Bangladesh now faces an uncertain future with authoritarian rule broken but democratic alternatives still untested. Coming to Nepal, Nepal has plunged into fresh turmoil last week when massive youth-led, or rather Gen-Z protests forced KP Sharma Oli to resign from his prime ministership. The immediate trigger was the government banning 26 social media platforms including Facebook, TikTok and X, justified as a move against fake news, but the ban was widely seen as an assault of free expression and ignited demonstrations that quickly spread nationwide. The state's heavy-handed response included tear gas, arrests and live fire that left at least 51 dead and over 1,000 injured. This deepened public anger and drew attention into long-standing frustrations: high youth unemployment, chronic corruption, and a political class perceived as self-serving and detached from realities. These grievances tapped into a broader pattern of instability as Nepal has cycled through dozens of governments since 2008, none completing a single full term, leaving institutions fragile and reform stalled. Oli's resignation has paved the way for an interim administration to be formed under former Chief Justice of Nepal, Sushila Kharki. It is crucial to point out that disputes remain over whether parliament should continue or be dissolved ahead of elections. The crisis reflects not only discontent with censorship but also the exhaustion of a young population excluded from any decision making. The turmoil across India's neighborhood reveals a stark truth. South Asia's political orders, despite shared histories of resilience, remain brittle when confronted with economic shocks and public dissent. Without renewed legitimacy and more inclusive governance, instability risks hardening into the region's default condition. For India, this is not a distant problem. Its own security and stability are inseparable from the fate of the states around it. That is all from us today. This is Garima and you are watching the Asian Chronicle.